Good morning, and welcome to this live programming produced by the CSIS Energy Security and Climate Change Program. My name is Joseph Mikett, and our biggest question today is, can the U.S. succeed in creating a low carbon hydrogen economy? The U.S. has taken a variety of policy steps over the last couple of years, investments through the bipartisan infrastructure law in hydrogen hubs and infrastructure. And under the Inflation Reduction Act, passed a significant package of tax credits to incentivize the production of what many call the Swiss Army knife of decarbonization. If clean hydrogen can be made available affordably and at scale, it could really change the future of how we think about a decarbonized economy. But that if is big, introduces a lot of interesting questions. We're going to talk about those today. I'm grateful to be joined by two really excellent colleagues, John Larsen of the Rhodium Group and an affiliate of our program here at CSIS, and Maria Martinez, Director of Policy at Breakthrough Energy, have both looked at this issue in really, really rigorous and interesting ways. So we look forward to gathering their expertise. As you are watching today live, I encourage you to join the conversation. We're accepting questions via the box below the streaming window on the CSIS website. We've also got X, the social media platform, loaded up and ready to accept questions as well. As much as we can make this an interactive endeavor, we're happy to do so. I think one of the major questions when we consider this is what actually counts as clean hydrogen. The tax credits that were passed under the IRA were articulated, at least in draft form, by the Treasury Department in December of last year. That rule, or proposed rule, is open for public comment for most of the rest of this month. The comment period closes in February 26th. And the basic question is, how do we think about awarding tax credits for the production of hydrogen at low emissions, and what defines low emissions? The conversation as it has developed has focused on three key pillars. Is hydrogen, excuse me, I lost my notes. It's concentrated on three key pillars. Are we adding renewable resources or other clean resources when we generate this clean hydrogen, or are we sacrificing from other places? When a firm or a company is making clean hydrogen, are they really buying clean power in a way that we think the emissions that the hydrogen that's generated can suitably be called clean in a way that's meaningful for long-term decarbonization? And are we doing this in a way that really matches in time and in space the availability of renewable resources to generate clean hydrogen? These are all tricky issues that then invoke the mechanics of the power sector and really stress and create some risks of degenerate policy outcomes. And the Treasury, in articulating the tax credits, were careful, I think, to avoid some of those more degenerate outcomes. The criticism now is that they may have gone too far and will prevent the growth of this industry that the U.S. really stands to take the lead in. I'm going to welcome John to offer some opening comments about how we should think about these different pillars, how we should think where the conversation is, and what the work the Rhodium Group has done on these matters. John, over to you.
Thanks, Joseph. Thanks to CSIS for putting together this important conversation and for having me here today. It's always great to hang out with the team at CSIS. And thanks everybody for joining. So I think there's a few broad things to think about here. The first is that hydrogen can be made in many ways, and much of what I'm about to say is focusing on electrolytic hydrogen. Some people call it green, where you're using water and electricity to split molecules into hydrogen and oxygen. But there are other components of this tax credit that are worth exploring, I think, later in this conversation around electrolytic hydrogen from existing resources versus new, and also from biogenic inputs. But to just start with what the IRS laid out in its draft guidance, because it's worth noting they kind of made a clear proposal on electrolytic for new resources, and then asked a lot of questions about everything else. And on the electrolytic new, which by the way is like where most of the activity and conversation and focus is, and frankly, when we're talking about building a new clean hydrogen industry in America, this is largely where people feel this is the center of the universe, is around these three pillars. So regionality, incrementality, and temporal matching. And in the proposal itself, our view of Rhodium is that they did a pretty good job of using metrics that are simple, kind of binary, clear, as opposed to like onerous and long, multi-step tests. That's just important because if we want an industry to grow fast, having clear rules that are simple to follow and simple to demonstrate is easier for industry to follow through on, and easier for IRS to just say, yeah, that's a clean hydrogen plant, right? Like, I mean, that's from a administratability perspective, that's really important. So with these three pillars, the first is around regionality, which is pretty simple, is the electrolyzer you are building using energy from the same power grid? If you're located in the ISO New England, making sure that the clean power you are using is also located, or at least deliverable into ISO New England, for example. The second is incrementality, which is some people used to use the word additionality. This is different in the sense that there is no proof or neat test here of would this have happened otherwise, because that's really hard in any policy context to prove that. Instead, is this new resources on the grid that's being built to supply this new demand, right? And with that, you've got to show as someone trying to take the credit that you're securing clean electrons from zero emitting resources that have been that are coming online within 36 months of in service of your facility. So it's not some wind farm that was built in the 90s. This is like new stuff this decade. And then finally, on temporal matching, the endpoint here is starting in 2028 is for all facilities that are eligible for the credit to match every megawatt hour of demand at the electrolyzer with an increment of new, clean, regionally dispatched power that was generated in the same hour. That is a fairly high bar. There are not a lot. There are some private sector entities doing renewable procurement today using that framework, but it's not widespread. It does make a difference emissions-wise. We'll talk about that in a second. Requiring that hourly matching for sure. The other important thing is, unless you're like plugging the clean power straight into the electrolyzer, you need some sort of framework to track these hourly credits and match them to demand. Currently, there is no like single database tracking system that is nationwide and easy to use that everybody could just point to and be like, oh yeah, we'll just use that, right? So with that in mind, IRS is prudent in saying, okay, we're not going to require people to do that right away. We're going to have a phase-in so that you can do annual matching, which is easily done and demonstrated with current frameworks and tracking systems through 2027, and then everybody's got to flip over to hourly in 2028. So that's kind of a key point of flexibility that was put into this proposal that I think a lot of people were arguing whether or not even that was necessary from a does this stifle initial investment or not?
I'm sorry to jump in, but one of the things that I struggle with, and I think a lot of people in the audience struggle with, is how technical this conversation becomes, like really, really quickly.
Right.
So can I ask you, what are these three pillars: regionality, incrementality, or I commit the sin of still using the term additionality. I know that like economists get mad about that. And then the time matching. What are we trying to prevent here? Because if I just kind of take the like, all right, we all agreed we're going to have a tax credit to generate clean hydrogen. Like, why can't I just buy a bunch of electrolyzers, plug them into the grid, and make clean hydrogen?
Yeah, I mean, the simple answer is, at least today, 60% of the generation on the grid is fossil. And so if we do exactly what you just described, there will be emissions associated with running our electrolyzer. On top of that, electrolyzers, while they run on electricity, are relatively inefficient compared to other new electric loads, like say electric vehicles.
Right.
So every little bit of emissions associated with inputs into electrolyzer matters a lot more than say for electric vehicle.
Like in a final energy consumption sense.
That's right.
So so help me understand, like if I kind of take the devil's advocate position, right? Like did Congress legislate that as a big part of concern, or do they want to make hydrogen that is like can be like reasonably called clean? Like, are we over-solving?
I mean, Maria was close to the congressional conversation. She should maybe chime in here.
Okay, well, let's pin that. But I do think that's an important thing, right?
Yeah, I mean, the intent. I mean, so it's worth noting that you can get different tiers of credit in this tax credit based on your carbon intensity, and the intention here was to incentivize the cleanest production. You get more money the cleaner you are. And the truth is, there is no single power regional grid in America that is clean enough right out of the gate to meet that standard.
Okay. So then let's go to the other side.
Yeah.
Right. So, okay, plugging into the grid, we still have a lot of fossil generation. You're not going to get clean energy. You're not going to get clean hydrogen according to the requirements of the tax credit, unless you're buying RECs or other things, which we can talk about. The other side is, why don't I just build a big solar farm or a big wind farm, run my electrolyzers on that? For a firm or anybody looking to do that project, what's the barrier?
Well, first of all, there are lots of firms looking at that. So this is not, in fact, those that have already announced projects that look like that have, they shouldn't be concerned at all about any of these requirements because they meet them all right out of the gate. But the big challenge there is twofold. One, you're going to have a very different geographic distribution of investment if you're just doing what I refer to as like hardwired electrolyzers to wind farms like off the grid, because you're only going to go where you have really good wind and solar coincident, because you need enough clean gen in enough hours of the day to run your electrolyzer like pretty steadily. Yeah. Right. And so wind alone won't do it. Solar's only good on a sunny, when the sun's out. So you need the combo. And there are lots of places in America that do that, but it's a relatively discrete set of places, which is different than if you buy RECs, on an hourly basis and match it with demand, and you can do it anywhere in America as long as you can procure the clean energy, right? That's one trade-off. The other is not all electrolyzer technology can run flexibly enough to accommodate that kind of combo generation between wind and solar. And different OEMs have different things to say about what their capabilities are, but it is true there's a difference across different products. And so that would, if you only did hardwired clean gen, new clean gen, you might be disincentivizing certain technologies at such an early stage in this industry that we don't know what the implications will be. Maybe we're going to miss out on some real innovation, right? Nobody wants to do that. Everybody wants 1,000 flowers of bloom here, and hopefully, everything's amazing. But you can't. So I think that's the other reason why this additional flexibility is in here, is to just accommodate different configurations.
Right. Okay. Let's bring Maria into the conversation. Maria, John invoked you on the congressional point, but I'd love to hear your thoughts and your views on kind of at the high level, what are we trying to accomplish here, and how does the way these rules look like they're being put together help us do that?
Yeah, and thanks for the invitation, Joseph. So good to be here, and great to join John in a good conversation about hydrogen. It's interesting for those of you, by the way, that don't know Breakthrough Energy, we're a network of philanthropic investment and policy initiatives founded by Bill Gates, all committed to accelerating the journey to a clean energy future. And so we look a lot at policy, and we think about technology development and innovation and how to get technologies from lab to market as quickly as possible, which we believe we'll need to decarbonize. So in the context of hydrogen, it's one of those things that 3 years ago, I think you heard very little about, and then it became, the Swiss Army knife of decarbonization. So now there's all this interest in getting from zero to hero really quickly. And, certainly my humble opinion is we've been putting a lot on the shoulders of this one singular tax credit. I mean, it's certainly transformative. And there's a lot of other elements of this ecosystem that matter a whole lot, in addition to how these particularities of the three pillars and other parts of the rule land. So I'll just say, and I'm happy to go back to congressional intent in a second, I'll just share maybe three things that we are thinking about and that we think will be very influential to market development beyond, some of the three pillar nuances John just covered. One of those is there's still a lot of innovation happening on clean hydrogen technologies. I'm sure listeners have heard of the different colors of the hydrogen rainbow. Personally, I think that's, it's handy shorthand, but it's also more productive to think about the carbon intensity of the whole process. And so, we've talked a lot about electrolyzers already, but there's other ways of making clean hydrogen that are supposed to be contemplated as part of this tax credit. It's technology neutral or technology inclusive. So we're looking at things like pyrolysis or geologic, or otherwise known as natural hydrogen, that's sort of found in natural deposits underground. There's other ways, that we can see this industry evolve over the years. And one thing we want to ensure is that the rules as written are very clear and don't disadvantage those early entrants, especially if they are not included in something called GREET, which is the life cycle analysis methodology prescribed by statute to calculate the carbon intensity, and why we have all these three pillar rules. So that's something important, right? Just providing that certainty and clarity, not just for existing technologies, but for future ones. The second one is, I think we take for granted that there's still pretty limited demand for clean hydrogen. Long-term offtake contracts are still extremely hard to come by, but they're very critical to financing new projects. And so, that's something that continues to be a challenge, even though we have this really great incentive on the table, and there's a lot of learning that's happening as we go. Contracts terms are really complex, and the first movers are kind of going as they learn and figuring out what kinks need to be worked out along the way. And then the third thing I'll say is, infrastructure is a really big piece here, not just storage infrastructure for hydrogen and pipelines to move it, but actually the broader enabling infrastructure environment. I think about 2 months into the year last year, I realized that 45V would maybe be more powerful power sector policy than we imagined, given these three pillar rules. So I think there's a lot of concern, for example, from certain developers and projects that we talk to, that there's challenges with meeting things like this incrementality rule because we can't build fast enough, right? We can't get renewables online fast enough, transmission, grid congestion. These are all issues. And certainly, and that actually keeps me up at night for the broader clean energy transition, not just electrolyzers. So these other enabling infrastructures will maybe be greater rate limiters than we realize. And that's certainly another challenge we're thinking through. And so those are other elements that I think are sort of wrapped around the envelope of this credit that will really impact what the next 5, 10, 15 years look like.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, this concept of going from zero to hero, you said it, not me, is really interesting to me, because I see these I'm trying to navigate this debate and understand it, right? I'm not asking anybody here to take sides, but you sort of see these vastly different visions of the future, right? Like, we want to go make a bunch of clean hydrogen, dominate this energy industry, be the source of the best electrolyzers and business models that can get hydrogen out into the world. You also see folks who see hydrogen as a necessary solution, but kind of look at the factors that John was talking about, of the energy inefficiency of electrolysis and the need to have clean electricity to power other parts of the economy. It is a sticky a sticky wicket as we try to figure out like which approach do we want to take, right? Like bounty or focused efficiency. John, you and Rhodium have done a lot of work trying to understand the implications of how this, how this like kind of what I'm going to call an intermediate model, right, has been set up. Clear rules. Some on the industry side thinks too restrictive. Some on the environmental side too rewarding. But what's your view on what the outlook can look like, both for those technologies we think are kind of like well characterized, and maybe some of the ones that Maria's talking about like could grow over time?
Yeah, I mean, so the first thing to look at is like, well, what's already announced, right? Like what's in the pipeline. And we at Rhodium Group maintain a data set called the Clean Investment Monitor. We do it with in partnership with MIT. One of the things we track is clean investment in electrolyzers, and we're seeing announced projects totaling 4.7 gigawatts of load, of peak load, in 2027. And most of that kind of is proposed to come online, between like 2025. It's the start. And now it's important to note that's the announced before the guidance came out, right? So it's a little hard to say, other than reading between the lines on people's comments on the proposal, like if that number would change now that people understand the rules. Right. Also, it's probably not the best idea to announce a big giant project if you don't know what the rules are, right? Like, so, unless you're really sure that you're feeling good about the investment. So, take that, it could go either way, right, on that. What we looked at was not, okay, what would the rules do to deployment? We said, okay, assuming these proposed rules, what does it mean for emissions, right? Like, do the three pillar as manifested in this proposal, what do they do?
Right.
And per kind of the earlier part of this conversation, there's two parts to the answer. There's kind of the short-term emissions implication on the grid, and then the long-term. Short-term is just with the grid we have, with the power plants we have, you add this incremental load, and more power plants run, right? Like, so most of that's going to be fossil. That's going to be higher emissions, even with annual matching to start. And then there's the long term, which is like, okay, the grid adjusts to this new load, new things get built. If it doesn't take much, you look at EIA, most things getting built these days are clean, right? So that number is usually smaller, right? That long-term emissions impact. And if we look just at that 4.7 gigawatts and we look at the cumulative emissions implications out to 2035 of just that capacity. So we expect more to get built post 2027, but at that point, everybody's on hourly matching and shouldn't have additional incremental emissions. That's like the way we see this. But everything in before that with the phase in and everything, we're actually seeing like a small net emission reduction. So, 14 to 45 million metric ton reduction in net US power sector emissions over the cumulative 2024 to 2035. That sounds like a big number. When you spread it over 11 years, it's actually, very like 1% of a power sector. But the key point is it's all negative. It's good. Like it's clean hydrogen production is contributing to lower emissions in America. And that's because of the way the three pillars are set up. That's how we actually see it like kind of accomplishing the mission as intended here. We should say that because of that phase in of hourly, there's actually time, like they're leaving some tons on the table. Like, you could have gotten greater emission reductions if you phased in that hourly requirement sooner. But I think, again, there is no national tracking system. It's a little hard to do this right out of the gate. Some time to adjust to a new reality is important. So, there's a trade. It's not like IRS was like, we're just going to go hardcore, like bring down the hammer and be as clean as possible on day one. That's quite the contrary. They're actually like this run up to hourly does lead to some emissions.
Explain for the novice what a run up to hourly matching looks like in practice, right? So, right now, if I'm gonna, I've got a side gig, I got a bunch of electrolyzers. right now I don't need to match on an hourly basis my renewables procurement with my hydrogen production. I can average that over a year as written, right? By 2027, I need to be able to do that compliance at a much finer resolution in time. Is that kind of how we should think about it? And what does that phase in actually look like?
I mean, it's almost like a turn of the corner, right? Like 2027, it's pretty easy. It's hourly. I mean, annual. And then January 1, 2028, it's hourly. And, it is important to note, like in most procurement setups, it won't be the electrolysis operator like going out. There's a third party like doing the procurement or like, some middle person helping to make the deals here. And I think this is really important. Like the most important thing around tax guidance around this credit is the presence of tax guidance. Right. The details are important. I'm not trying to trivialize that, but like having no guidance means no one knows what to do and no one will put down money and we won't see any investment. Right. So the fact that there is now guidance and it does have this framework and it does have this phase in does two things. One, those with the technology that is compatible and ready to go can make plans and get to final investment decisions, start to break ground. And then meanwhile, the supply side of the market, the clean electric supply side of the market is going to figure out how to service these electrolyzer operators. And it's important to note, there are regional tracking systems already in place in some parts of the country that can accommodate the hourly requirement today.
Right.
And there will be more, either patchwork regional or some sort of national system that will get constructed over time, and that's not rocket science. It just there hasn't been a need. That's why it's there.
Let me push back on you there. Like, has there really not been a need? I mean, one of the critiques, if you spend a lot of time on right-wing media, of kind of clean energy targets set by corporations, like let's say any of the big tech companies that run big server farms, has been they're not actually 100% renewable power, right? There's a shell game that sort of accompanies all of this. And it seems like there are a lot of places, as firms are looking toward voluntary regulatory decarbonization or economic opportunities like from these hydrogen production, that this kind of, what actually counts as clean on a fixed grid, it does need to be accounted for. Like, are we actually just setting up something we actually think we need over the next couple decades?
Yeah, I mean, well, it's interesting to take a step back, right? Like if we had a 100% clean electric standard in place, none of this matters. Right. Because eventually we know, let's say call it 2035, 40, whenever that target gets set to get met, everything's clean and nobody needs to ask these questions anymore. We are operating a world without that, right? Like, so so if we're going to be adding big chunks of new load to the grid, and we care about long-term emissions, and we are handing out billions of dollars to some of those load centers to make new things that we think are important. In the absence of other like overarching policy, like a clean electric standard or a cap and trade program would be another one, but that's a couple decades ago. Then we've got to do something here, and frankly, it's to speak to that concern of like, is this stuff really clean? And I should also say, like, back to just like, okay, now that on the transition point, it is worth noting, like, again, there are some real big projects being proposed that like just hardwire a bunch of wind and solar off the grid. All that's good to go day one. None of the things we're talking about are like all that. I mean, as long as the wind and solar is getting built within 3 years of in service, that's what matters to them. But like, so it's worth noting, this is we're not talking about the entire industry getting bound up in this. There are subsets of it that are basically clear.
Please, Maria, go ahead.
I was just going to jump in here and say, John's earlier point on the general inefficiency of this process, particularly electrolysis, that merits a little bit of a step back, because the pillars, the key ingredients for decarbonization usually start with, efficiency or reducing demand, and then you move on to, like, electrify as much as you can, and then make generation clean. And then there's a sort of third category of, like, if those first two aren't good options, or it's not enough, or they're cost prohibitive, then you start thinking about, what is the alternative source of energy? And that's where hydrogen's really promising for things like industry or heavy transport, where the first two are not enough, or they're cost prohibitive, or there's limits to the physics of the ability to, power airplanes with batteries, for example. Right. And so when you get to that stage and you say, okay, there's sort of priority uses for this technology, and that's an important element to walk into this conversation with, because it sort of ends up encouraging the idea that we should be selective about how we're making it. It really does need to be clean, and that, it's not going to be particularly easy, but it merits, because there's this, full spectrum of decarbonization solutions, that if we're going to use energy in such an inefficient way generally to make this energy carrier, hydrogen, then, like, we really should be thoughtful about how to do it. That doesn't mean it's easy, but I just thought I'd sort of do that larger framing for the audience, because it's a useful way for us to view this problem at a higher level. It's
a great point. And we have, in my view, we have mechanisms to do that, right? So you raised earlier in your comments the idea that, like, demand side is important too, right? Like, somebody has to buy this hydrogen, right? Somebody needs to use it for any of this to be commercializable or scalable, let alone sustainable, both economically and environmentally. How much, and we've got the Hydrogen Hubs program. That there's a demand system being set up on that side of through that program to help sort of kickstart from the demand side the role that clean hydrogen is going to play in our economy. So how much do you see demand side mechanisms playing a role in helping to steer how we think about the role of hydrogen in a low carbon economy or toward net zero?
I have an answer for that, but I think John probably has another good perspective. I'll say, yeah, it's interesting, because there's some initial concern when this tax credit was announced, and a lot of these clean hydrogen incentives, that the lowest hanging fruit, the sort of easiest, most obvious use, would be in the power sector. And what we've noticed is actually the willingness to pay at this point in time is actually not necessarily the sectors you would expect. It's stuff like aviation, right? There's some power to liquid type of e-fuel that right now is sort of the sector that's willing to, in small volumes, pay that higher premium. That doesn't mean they can carry that into infinity. Of course, aviation's a very price sensitive sector, but they're the ones that are helping do some of those longer term offtakes. And so, and yet it's still wildly expensive. So we're seeing state policies actually start to complement the federal policies we saw come through from the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. And then I think there's a huge role for other markets. Other countries are starting to do their own demand side policy. Sometimes it looks like a contract for difference. Sometimes it looks like blending mandates. And that's going to create a really interesting dynamic, especially if the US clean hydrogen production is ultra clean, right? It sort of carries a premium in the global market. And so I think that will help as well. But John, you might have something to add here. I know you've been thinking about this as well.
Yeah, I mean, so a couple things. One is I failed to mention before in the emissions numbers I recited that we're assuming that clean hydrogen is displacing gray hydrogen, or like conventional hydrogen made with natural gas and no additional mitigation on emissions. That's how you get your net emission reduction. So that just like, and we look at, there's lots of things that hydrogen can be used for or displace other emitting uses. That is like one of the like more simpler things to talk about, which is why we chose that. But like to Maria's point, there's lots of different places where this could get used. And I think at the end of the day on demand, well, I mean, maybe it's worth talking about why we're even talking about a tax credit. Like clean hydrogen cost of production today is a matter of debate, but it could be as high as $5 a kilogram, like before we talk about incentives, maybe 6. And or maybe it's closer to 3. Like, it's a little hard, depending on who you talk to. And one of the big questions is how much you're paying for electrons to run your machine. The top tier of the tax credit is $3 a kilogram. So let's say just for fun math, right? Like, let's say your cost of production is $4. You get a $3 tax credit. Conventional hydrogen is somewhere in the $1 to $1.50 per kilogram range, depending on the price of natural gas, right? So, like, before we even really talk about displacing stuff in demand, we got to talk about the fact that if all you're doing is relying on tax credits, you got to get the delivered cost down into the same competitive ballpark as conventional hydrogen, which is why we're talking about this. Now, if you told me before the IRA that 4.7 gigawatts of electrolyzers are going to be proposed to come online by 2027 in America, I would have not taken you seriously. So, like, there's a there with this tax credit and these values.
Just point of order, help us understand 4.7 gigawatts. Like, for
so that, yeah,
I mean, so that's 1/10 of California's average power load, roughly.
It's about a third of New England's peak in a year, right? Which is, like, not small. And I mean, or it's like all of Massachusetts peak load, in just for electrolyzers.
So a non-trivial amount of capacity is conceived.
Yes, and it's like multiple million tons of hydrogen production from that, like 1 or 2, I think, and like current U.S. production is like 10 or 11.
Right.
So it's like a big chunk. And so this is like a major chunk of deployment we're talking about, apparently spurred by the IRA. It's a little hard to know you can't do complete attribution here, but like that just goes to what I'm saying is, like, people, clearly the market thinks there's a there, that this tax credit will be enough to give them a market opportunity they wouldn't have had otherwise. Then it's back to Maria's point. What markets, why are they the right ones for emission reductions? And I think there's a long and a short term aspect to that. Like, are you just getting in to get paid to make hydrogen, and then down the road you're going into like electrofuels and SAF, and that's like the best, that's the highest and best use kind of world. But like, it's going to be messy. That's the way markets work.
So let's talk about that messiness a little bit. And this is a question that's inspired by some of the questions we've been getting via the box online. And for those who are offering questions, thank you so much. Like, this is elevating the discussion by your participation. I've heard a lot of concern. I'm hearing it in the chat, and I've heard it around town that under this set of rules, like the Hydrogen Hubs program, which is supposed to be the program that resolves a lot of the questions that that John and Maria have been talking about, right? Who's going to buy, at what price, how do we build the right infrastructure, right? That is distinct from a tax credit. It's a program where, like, coordinated action between firms, governments, and nonprofits can sort of like articulate some of those choices. But there's now some concern that the way the rules have been written will hamstring the ability of those things to launch, right? I've heard it. And so how should we think about that program's success now that we have an articulation of the 45B tax credit? I will admit, I feel two ways about that. I've studied hydrogen hubs. I think they're a really exciting model for the US, and I really want them to flourish. So, oh my gosh, let's do what we can for them. Hydrogen hubs were also created before the 45B tax credit was offering $3 a kilogram for hydrogen. And so I'm not, we should think about their success perhaps independently. So offer those that potential conflict and that concern to both of you as something we should, find a path to resolve.
Maria, do you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, I feel very similarly conflicted, Joseph, and your point on just, the order of operations was that the bipartisan infrastructure law was created first and passed prior to the tax credit. So that is one indication of maybe what Congress intended is for these things to be independently successful, to your point. I think there's a long-term view here we can think about. And to John's point from, a little while ago, the way these rules are written will mean some regions just make more sense for near-term production, because that's where there's ample and low-cost renewable energy. You could say that's what makes sense, right? You have that low-carbon electricity, and that's where it's likely to be that we have these centers and these production regions, and that's where the supply starts, blossoming in the next few decades. I also wonder, should we be supporting projects that at the end of 45V, whenever that may be, assuming we don't extend it, that wouldn't make sense once that happens, right? What is the kind of long-term market we want to see? I don't know that that's a question that I singularly...
we all know that we're going to have a globally harmonized carbon price by that time, so don't worry about it.
Totally. Yeah, I don't know what we're even talking about. But, that's an interesting question that I think about often, is what is that long-term market going to look like?
I'll jump in before we go to John. And I'll say also, I think we have to be attentive to the success of the hubs, but it is also true that they are built with the flexibility that the tax credits are not, right? They are designed so that you can change the way the subsidies or the awards work to make sure that you can get them to launch. I think it's a reasonable concern, but if the success of the hydrogen hubs, to me, isn't exclusive, if it should not exclusively rely on tax credits. John.
Yeah, I'd agree. And, I think the kind of binary of the guidance that's proposed may totally undermine the viability of these hubs. Is obviously, there are very few policy debates where it's that simple, right? I think it's worth going down a level or two. And it's worth noting, most of the hubs have nothing to do with renewables, at least on their face. So instead, we're talking about using existing nuclear or natural gas and carbon capture, the latter of which could be eligible for some amount under 45V, but also, it could also choose 45Q for CO2 capture, right, at which point none of the life cycle issues apply. Right. It's 45Q is just, did you or did you not shove that ton underground? And so it's a little hard for me to see how 45V guidance makes or breaks a gas with carbon capture hub.
Yep.
Just for that reason. On the existing nuclear options, this is the area where IRS took a lot of comment and didn't make a lot of decisions in the proposal, for the reason that we were just talking about. If you plug a new electrolyzer into an existing grid or even into an existing clean generator, we know what happens. Some other dirty gen is going to happen to make up the difference. And
marginal generation.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, we've seen this with recent nuclear retirements. I live in New England. 2 nuclear plants came offline in the last 5 years, and 85% of the fill-in generation was natural gas combined cycle units. So it's not theoretical. This is the way it works. Now, we also know that Congress said some nuclear should qualify, existing nuclear should qualify for 45V. It was kind of a little squishy, but it's in there. And then there's these hubs, right? So I think a very practical question is, how can IRS thread the needle to recognize the requirements or guidance or congressional intent, how that may or may not be compatible with these current hubs proposals, and maybe put some guardrails or ring fence the potential emission implications. There's going to be emissions implications of running electrolyzers on existing nuclear. And they took comment on a lot of different ways that could happen. Most of them, from our view, do lead to a net increase in emissions, but it doesn't, completely undermine the world. So if we're back into an argument of is this worth it to get technology off the ground? I think we're in that ballpark.
Yeah. Can I actually interrupt and kind of push us in that direction a little bit, being attentive of time? One thing I want to kind of like come out a level, apologies to my incrementalist colleagues, and say like, you know, part of how I think we evaluate success here is thinking about what the long-term goals of this investment-based strategy we've taken on climate change and emissions is, right? Like, we lost the fight, the US speaking, for technological primacy in solar panels, right? Or in EV batteries. And as we think about kind of navigating our way forward, electrolyzers and hydrogen technology, it doesn't seem like any country, any firm has really captured that market, right? So one school of thought is, let's try to make as tech neutral and as enabling a policy environment as we can. As Maria said earlier, like, let's let people build stuff and we'll kind of see what works, and we'll be comfortable with challenges and a little bit of creative destruction along the way, for the long-term view of having the ability for the US to be a player in providing low carbon, low emissions hydrogen in whatever way we need it 30 years from now, when we're all driving around in, sustainably powered hydrogen-based fuel classic cars from the 1950s or whatever. There's lots of interesting ways to think about it. And also just like create a public good that's going to benefit global decarbonization. We don't often, we get so focused on the micro, we don't talk about it at that scale. But I know that is something that Breakthrough thinks a lot about, right? I know that's something that John, you and I have talked about. So kind of like, if I can take you a step back and just ask for your editorial thoughts on like, is this the right way to do this kind of industrial policy? Are we making the right trade-offs? Are we muddling our way through? Or have we, or do we need to recalibrate with either a longer term or some other view?
You are asking all the easy questions, Joseph. I mean, look, I think that if this year has taught me something, this past year, is that we must have tremendous humility about how much we don't know and can't anticipate. There's so much innovation happening so quickly, and I say this as someone that gets to have the pleasure of talking to innovators every day and entrepreneurs who are doing really cool, kooky stuff from the lab all the way through, the lab bench all the way through, demonstrating really interesting, first of a kind facilities. And the pace of innovation is insane, right? Like, we don't really know what we'll see in the next 5 years. Maybe geologic hydrogen, sort of takes over, and that becomes the prevailing low cost way. And we don't have to have an electricity problem anymore. I mean, it's like, if we really want to pontificate, it could be really interesting 5-10 years. So I think that's why we need to think about these things fitting as a puzzle, right? Like, this is an important credit for sure. It's critical to decarbonizing supply, and we need to look at the bigger picture because it all needs to be tended to for the long-term success. So both demand side, which we've talked about, but being more thoughtful about infrastructure. I just was part of a really interesting dialogue a few weeks where there's a lot of concern about the lack of clarity of even which agency is responsible for regulating, blended versus neat hydrogen, and how much infrastructure we'll need. And depending on whether you think transporting pure hydrogen versus derivatives is easier or lower cost, you get different answers. And so there's so much that we're facing in the next 5 to 10 years as part of this ecosystem that we'll need to grapple with. And so I don't mean to be hand wavy about the importance of landing these details of this one credit, right. But I think we will sort of, the way that I've boiled it down in my mind is that there's a floor where we are too tight and nothing happens, and then there's a ceiling where, there's a pretty significant net negative impact on power sector emissions. And I think we've done a lot of work in the last year to identify that floor and ceiling, and right. Landing somewhere in the middle is probably going to be okay. So I know there's different opinions about whether we've found the right ceiling and floor, but that's how, I think it's helpful to view this.
Washington, there's bound to be disagreement. John Larsen, on the same matter.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Maria just said, and just to add a couple of things. First of all, like, in the American system of government, we're already in like third best world just to start, right? Like on any policy issue anywhere, like that's just, with filibusters and divided government and, lots of fun things. You just can't, there's no, it's hard to do the like first best obvious thing, right? So back to your point of like, are we even doing this right? It's like, well, at least we're doing it because well, first, just reminder, we weren't doing it for 20, 25 years, like in just the last couple of years where we started to do it. Like, it's worth just saying that out loud. Like, I think it's easy to forget how far we've come in such a short amount of time, policy-wise. And why I say that is because from our perspective, it's like the more solutions we have available to solve this problem, the better. They're not all going to be awesome. All of them are going to have trade-offs. Some of them could have like some not great downside surprises and that we need to be cognizant of. We don't know how they're all going to play nice together or not and how it's going to play out. But if we have fewer options, it will take longer, be harder, cost more to get from here to there, right? And so, before 45V, we at Rhodium, we're not talking seriously about a major hydrogen market in America, period. Like hydrogen was just not going to be one of the solutions in the toolbox. And now we are, right? Like that binary is, I think, a very important step. And to Maria's point, like finding the ceiling and floor and helping people make good decisions to hopefully stay within that zone without compromising a nascent industry is a balance that, I don't envy the IRS, but at the same time, like I am just happy we're here because it's not obvious that we needed to be here, right? Like, it's this is just the fact that we're doing this is remarkable, given the history of clean energy in the United States.
And John, who would have thought that we could have an engaging conversation on the details of hydrogen tax policies for 50 minutes and not only keep our attention and a lively conversation going, but also keep the attention of our colleagues who are watching. There's no better people to live in a third best world with. To close, here's what I propose. You guys want to do a lightning round?
Why not?
Okay.
Sure.
We've left so-called blue hydrogen, low emissions hydrogen produced from fossil fuel feedstocks. Relatively unaddressed. The CSIS has done a variety of programming. We've got a piece coming up on the outlook there, but your guys' thoughts on the outlook for that pathway with the 45E tax credit. Go ahead. Lightning round. Short answers, please.
Go, Maria.
I will say I've been shocked, surprised, whichever word makes people at least uncomfortable about how much, we haven't seen retrofitting happening. I think that points back to the need for broader carbon pricing policies that can help encourage that. But we certainly would like to see more decarbonization of the existing production because we recognize that's an important source of hydrogen and it's a thriving commodity with lots of workers and industry users. So I think there's more work to do to ensure that the existing production is decarbonized. And it's been interesting to see how much sort of new blue, so to speak, there's been probably because of 45Q, because it's just easier and more straightforward.
John Larsen, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to just building on that last point. Like we expected only retrofits because 45Q and these SMRs are relatively new and it's been surprising to see as little retrofit and like multiple tons of new SMRs with carbon capture, going ahead because 45Q doesn't have all the baggage that 45E has. And so it looks like it'll be around for a while in a way that maybe I didn't fully appreciate a year ago.
Yeah, thanks. We see it. We've talked to a lot of folks who are looking at 45E and 45E. New facilities offer a lot of opportunities for efficiencies that the old ones don't. Super interesting. Whole nother conversation, I think. A couple questions here about these kind of like regional markets, the time matching, the accounting of all that. John, if you could briefly give us a response on kind of where is that working best in existing markets, and what models do we need to see for the successful development of a program by 2027?
Yeah, I mean, the PJM, the largest power grid in America, they literally flipped on this capability like a couple months ago. They already had a complete footprint-wide tracking system, and then they went to hourly. So that's probably the best example of hourly matching in the wild working, or at least the capability to track hourly. And I should say it's the biggest grid, and it's like a third of total load in America. Like, I mean, it is, it's a pretty big market. So that's, I think, a good thing to look for. The next frontier is getting kind of that level of like compliance grade tracking elsewhere. There are voluntary registries for these things now, and that's a great start. But like something that kind of follows all of the same Q&A and assurance as like an RTO level tracking system is going to be kind of key for everybody just be able to go in and buy the things they need from people who know how the market works. Like that's ultimately where we want to go.
Right.
And that's going to take a little while.
All right. Smooth transactions. Colleagues, I want to thank you both so much for sharing your knowledge and insights today. This is a sticky conversation, but I've actually come away with a lot of great perspectives, and I hope our audience has as well. For those who joined us online, we are so grateful for your attention. Hope that you continue to follow the work of Maria and John. Both have robust online presences via Breakthrough and Rhodium, respectively. And you two are always welcome back here at CSIS anytime. So thank you so much for joining. Thank you, colleagues, for tuning in. And until next time, this is Joseph Mikett signing off.